which means that this is only the beginning. Sea level is going to rise faster and faster with time. We know that things can get a lot worse, so to speak. During Meltwater Pulse 1A, 14,000 years ago, sea level was rising 4 meters per century. It did that for several centuries, and that's what happens when ice sheet collapses. And we also know from the top left here that if we warm the system by 1 degree, sea level should stand about 20 meters higher. And we don't know how long it takes to get to these 20 meters, but that's the end state. Talking about the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial from the Paris Accord, I don't think this is a safe spot for us in terms of sea level rise to think that if we stabilize at 1.5 degree, we'll be fine. We've learned tremendously in the past 30 years about measuring and understanding ice sheet loss. We have monthly data now. We have all kinds of details of what's happening. You see on these curves from the GRACE mission showing the mass change with time over the past 20 years. The curve is going down from left to right. It's Greenland, Antarctica, and then all of the world and mountain glaciers. The curve has a curvature because the mass loss is increasing with time. If you extrapolate that curve further down in time, we are on a trajectory right now for a meter sea level rise per century. What have we learned about ice melt? Well, of course, snow and ice melt at the surface. We're very familiar with that. We're familiar with these supraglacial rivers that make it down to the bed, and they can lubricate the bed and speed up the ice flow. But we know now that this is not the main vector of changes in the ice sheet. In fact, in Antarctica, it doesn't play any role. Ice flows, and we see these large rivers of ice that transport mass from the Antarctic continent to the edges. In a warmer climate, you can change snowfall by 20–30%. You can double or triple surface melt, but you can increase glacier speed by a factor 10. So glacier speed is really the vehicle for fast sea level rise in the future. These glaciers end up in the ocean, and they break up into icebergs. And what we learned in the past few years is that these icebergs is only half of the story. And in fact, I think they may not be a story at all. A lot of what's happening in terms of climate forcing is happening below the surface in contact with the ocean. And the iceberg is just a response to that. In contrast with the waters that we have off the coast of this beautiful museum, in the polar regions, ocean heat is found at depth. It's warm and salty from the formation of sea ice. It's present in the Antarctic circumpolar current that goes clockwise around the Antarctic continent. It generates melt rates at the grounding line of these glaciers of the orders of 100 to 200 meters per year, whereas at the surface, you have an input of mass from snowfall of about 10 to 20 centimeters per year. So most of the action in these places, and this is the same in lots of Greenland as well, is taking place at the bottom. Something we're not familiar with. Our eyes are not familiar with this landscape. The Antarctic circumpolar current has been changing. It's pushed around by the westerlies. The westerlies have increased in speed as a result of greenhouse gas emission and also the depletion of the ozone. And as a result, more ocean heat has been in contact with the glaciers and melting them faster and destabilizing them. We know about marine ice sheet instability that says that if a glacier is disturbed and retreats in a bed that gets deeper inland, that configuration is unstable. The glacier will keep retreating unstoppably until it reaches higher ground or it becomes completely afloat. And this theory was very well verified by looking at tidewater glaciers in Alaska. And for those who didn't get familiar with that literature, it's happening right now in Western Greenland and in West Antarctica. So ice sheet collapse will happen in this big submarine basin where the ocean can keep eating the ice. In Greenland, This is represented in blue on that color plot. We have three big submarine basins with a 3-meter sea level rise equivalent, controlled by 5 glaciers. 3 of major ice shelves controlling these 5 glaciers are already gone, and the other 2 are not in a very good shape. So we pretty much committed to seeing the collapse of at least 2 of these systems, the Jakobshavn and the Northeast Ice Stream system in Greenland already. In the Antarctic, we have lots of floodgates. The most important one, represented in red here, is the Pine Island Thwaites sector in West Antarctica that has a 1.2 meter sea level rise equivalent. And its retreat will entrain the retreat of the rest of the marine part of West Antarctica. That's a 3-meter total sea level rise. So we're very concerned about this sector. In 2014, we made a statement that this sector had passed the point of no return already. And now that we are 8 years later into this, I still stand pretty firm about that statement. The big question is, how long is it going to take? And is there something we can do to slow it down? But the retreat will be unstoppable. In terms of retreat rate, this region experiences the fastest retreat rates of glaciers on the planet. We're all familiar with retreat rates in the Alps, just a little bit, a few kilometers above here. They retreat at kilometers per century. In Greenland, the glaciers are retreating 0.5 kilometer per year. And in West Antarctica, they are retreating 1 kilometer to 3 kilometers per year, almost as fast as they move forward. So time is of the essence looking at the Antarctic because the changes are very rapid. We are also worried about a part of East Antarctica, which is on the bottom right corner of Antarctica in this map, the Wilkes Land sector, which has large submarine basin. They plotted in yellow in my graph because we are seeing glacier retreat, we are seeing glacier speed up and glacier thinning, not at the same rate as West Antarctica. These glaciers hold 12 meters of sea level rise. We're not able to model them very well because we don't know enough about the ocean waters and the cavities in this region. The first data on ocean water properties in front of Totem were just acquired 3 years ago. So there's a class of models in the community. Most IPCC models project a slow collapse of these regions, and some models, like the ones that Rob DeCanto talked about this morning, project much faster rates. And the big question is, it's the trillion-dollar question. You know, is this going to be fast or slow? And we can't quite answer that right now because there's a number of observations that are lacking that cannot be put into models because they've never been collected. And probably the most important example of that is to understand ice-ocean interaction in these cavities around the Antarctic. Most of them have never been explored. You cannot guess what's going on under there if you don't know the topography of these cavities and how much ocean heat is able to intrude in these cavities. To do this, we need, the technology exists. We need ice-breaking ships, we need ocean robotics, we need satellites, we need people on the ground. But it's analog to a moon landing. It's really hard to get to these places. Can we do it? Yes, we can do it. It will require proper investment and international partnership. I don't think any of this will be possible without international partnership. Not a single country will be able to do this. Give us 10 years. 10 years, and each partner should raise several $100 million. You might say, this is a lot of money, but this is really little compared to the cost of adaptation to sea level rise. Any large city facing adaptation to sea level rise will have to spend billions of dollars in adaptation in the coming decades. They don't like to think about that, but it's right around the corner. So just sparing 10 or 20% of these funds to provide more comprehensive observations, better scientific data, will largely repay itself down the line. And we should make some of these missions a little bit different, where data are distributed more rapidly to the community, not within years, but within months, or even shortly if we can. We need to provide real-time access to science in the Antarctic, like people do when we send a rover on Mars. And the whole public gets really excited to get real-time action on Mars. Why can't we do that about the Antarctic? It's such a beautiful and fascinating place. And we also need to grow our community, make it more diverse, but also try to encourage scientists from all horizons to join the effort. We're too small. I often say that we are climbing Everest in tennis shoes, and it's really time for polar science to step up because there's so much at stake for the planet in the polar regions. We have to step up in the level of effort we put into studying them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very sobering news, but I think that, as you said before, from 2014 on to now, there's nothing that goes against what you said in 2014. We've probably lost that part of West Antarctica. The question is, how fast? Do you have any more comment on that in terms of time span? Yes. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I'd wait to understand. Oh, okay. Yes, but it's not a doomsday scenario. Actually, I don't like the doomsday acronym for Thwaites Glacier. No, it's the problem with tipping points is that we're good at recognizing them once we pass them. So this is one of them. The retreat is unstoppable, but the rate of retreat will depend a lot also on what we do to the planet. It's not a lost cause, right? If Thwaites collapses in the next 50 years, that's one thing. If it takes 200 years, that's another. It's quite different for adaptation to sea level rise. So that's a little bit what's at stake. We have to send that message loud and clear. This is happening, but we have to also convey the idea to people. You can still do something about it. It's your choice.
Thank you. And I think that issue of choice is one of the most important messages we can get out there. It's a lot different for, low-lying countries like Bangladesh to adapt in 200 or 300 years to 3 meters of sea level rise versus 2,000 years. I'd like now to turn to Professor Marcus Rex and our other panel speakers. Marcus was the Mosaic Expedition leader. He's a senior researcher at the Alfred Wegener Institute. He leads the atmospheric physics section at AVI. He's also a full professor for atmospheric physics at the University of Potsdam, has worked at NASA's JPL laboratory, California Institute of Technology in the US, University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and has taught at the Free University of Berlin and of Bremen. And of course, as most of you know, the 2019-2020 Mosaic Expedition that he led was the largest Arctic expedition ever. So Marcus, when we contacted you on the Polar Stern from COP25, from the Cryosphere Pavilion, you made an incredibly impactful statement with a message from the Arctic, and that was picked up by BBC and many others. What message might you bring today if you were speaking?
Yeah, I think with that expedition, we have been in the center of action for climate change in the Central Arctic in winter. That is where things happen, and therefore I felt we, the expedition team out there, were in a good position to point out what's happening there. And after Fridtjof Nansen's pioneering expedition with the Fram 130 years ago, then the Soviet and Russian ice drifting stations over decades and the expedition of the Tara, we have brought for the first time for a full year a modern research icebreaker, a fully fledged, fully equipped modern research icebreaker into the Central Arctic ice drift system and followed the transpolar drift with the icebreaker for a full year, including the harsh winter season. And throughout the expedition, we really have seen and have felt how dramatically different the Arctic is already nowadays. It started right at the beginning in the first days. When we came there, our first task was to find a solid piece of ice to set up our research camp. We really wanted to set up 100 tons of scientific equipment on the ice, pretty substantial infrastructure there. And we couldn't find any for a long time. After the extremely hot 2019 summer, in fall 2019, the ice was completely eroded, really thin, and we had a hard time finding a good flow. Eventually we found one and we went into the drift. And in winter, we have encountered temperatures which were nearly continuously 10 degrees above those temperatures Fridtjof Nansen reported from his expedition 130 years ago. The ice was extremely thin and mobile, very dynamic. We were surprised to find such high ice dynamic, although we know what the Tara expedition also has seen. The ice nowadays is much more mobile and much more dynamic, constant formation of pressure ridges and leads, which kept us busy. And the ice drift was faster, 20% faster than we expected, just because the ice is more mobile and thinner, and therefore is driven faster by the wind. In summer, we have then seen the great melt of the Arctic, and it was really impressive to see it with our own eyes, not only with thermometers and instruments and scientific equipment. It was impressive to see that. The retreat of the ice in spring 2020, when we were in the Central Arctic, was faster than ever observed before, ever during the observational record. In fall, the reformation of the ice, the refreeze, was later than ever. And in summer 2020, the overall extent of the sea ice dropped below 4 million square kilometers for only the second time in the historical record. And I'm sure Julian will tell us more about the future perspectives of that. We have reached the ice edge in the Farm Strait as planned in July, late July 2020. And from there, we went back deep into the Arctic to the North Pole, and we took an unusual route north of Greenland. This is a region where we would typically expect the thicker and partly multi-annual ice, last retreat of that multi-annual ice. But what we have seen were huge stretches of open water. Sometimes we have seen open water to the horizon, and we made it in no time, within a few days, and at the maximum speed of polarstern without any resistance from the ice to the North Pole. And even at the North Pole itself, the ice was completely eroded and molten. Not just cracks and leads which were formed by dynamics in the ice, but clearly just a result of melting. That was quite impressive to see. We do have some better news from winter, because for the first time we were really able to observe in situ, being out there on the ice, the freezing process in winter. And we have seen that the freezing is still pretty healthy. A number of factors come together to make that freezing still a very efficient process. The snow cover on the ice is still thin, although overall the precipitation goes up, but the accumulation period goes down because the ice forms later in fall. That allows the cold of the atmosphere to penetrate through the ice into the column of water, and that leads to the freezing from the bottom of the ice. And we had 20 to 40 meters of the water column below the ice at the freezing point. That still is a healthy buffer for the winter freeze, and as of today, the winter freeze can partly offset that rapid melting of the summer, which means we have not crossed that tipping point yet. It puts a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, which means we are in the driving seat here. We can save the Arctic sea ice if we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions quickly and drastically now. Right now, the sea ice is still responding in a fairly direct and linear way to climate change. And if we stabilize the climate, then I think there is a chance that we can still stabilize the Arctic ice cover. We have a much more complete picture now of the climate processes in the Central Arctic, the complex interactions between the ocean, the ice, the snow, the atmosphere, the biogeochemistry, and the ecosystem. And that was only possible because Mosaic was a truly international activity. Overall, we have operated 7 research vessels and icebreakers during the expedition to support our flagship, Polarstern drifting with the ice. 20 nations came together to make that possible, and we had that fantastic multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary collaboration during the expedition, which allowed us to now come up with a much more detailed picture of the climate processes of the Central Arctic and to improve the representation of these processes in our climate models.
And it's really an excellent model moving forward for international research in these very difficult areas. I was wondering if you could expand just briefly on your own research in terms of this role of the Arctic stratosphere and its impact on the global climate system. What's changing and how is that affecting the rest of the planet?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's one of the prime examples which show us how coupled the climate system between all compartments in the Arctic really is. And then particularly strong here is the coupling between the lower levels of the atmosphere and the levels above the stratosphere where the ozone layer is. And in contrast to the overall tendency, which Eric has shown, that the jet stream becomes more unstable because the meridional temperature gradient, the contrast between the cold Arctic and the warmer middle latitudes, which is the engine for the jet stream, overall goes down. We every once in a while see those extremely strong polar vortex states, extremely strong jet stream states. And we had the strongest jet stream ever observed in spring of our expedition. And these days, today, we again have a really strong jet stream, a really strong polar vortex, which shows the variability goes up. The picture is more complex, and this is driven, the complexity here, by vertically propagating waves in the atmosphere, and then it gets really complicated. But the end result of that is that processes in the ozone layer are affected by climate change. And we have seen by far the largest ozone depletion in the Arctic in spring of the expedition. Within a few weeks only, 95% of the ozone up there in the heart of the ozone layer, where we would expect the maximum of the concentration, was destroyed, much more than ever observed before. And that was 20 years after the effect of the Montreal Protocol has efficiently banned the production of ozone-depleting substances worldwide. And that is now our modeling work shows us it's connected to climate change, and it's going to continue in the future if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And that means that in contrast to the ozone layer worldwide, the Arctic ozone layer is not going to recover during this century if we follow one of the higher emission pathways, if we go for one of the pessimistic scenarios. But it's in our hands. If we follow those emission pathways, which limit warming to 1.7 or maybe 2 degrees Celsius, then the Arctic ozone layer will recover, and it's in our hands. It's our responsibility to make sure that that's happening.
Thank you so much. It's now time to turn to a little bit more on Arctic sea ice interactions. Could you grab the clicker? Professor Julianne Strove, which we're happy to have here, was also on the Mosaic Expedition, of course. She is a senior Canada 150 research chair at the University of Manitoba, professor of polar observation and modeling at University College London, from which she has joined us today, and a senior research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. And her Arctic research interests are very wide-ranging and include atmosphere-sea ice interactions, sea ice predictability, remote sensing, and impacts on native communities as well, so a big package. And Julianne, Eric showed a picture of the relationship between Arctic sea ice and carbon dioxide concentrations, which of course continue to rise. Can you tell us a little bit more about the temperature threshold? And if you could bring up the Q&A slides, please, so that this could be seen a little bit more graphically.
Is this on? Is it on? Oh, good. Yeah, so back in 2016, Dirk Knotts and I decided to take a look at the relationship between the changes that we were seeing in the sea ice environment and how much CO2 we were putting in the atmosphere. And back then, we took the available satellite observations we had with earlier aircraft and ship observations, and we could see that there was a very strong linear relationship, such that for every metric ton of CO2 we would add to the atmosphere, we'd melt another 3 square meters of sea ice. Now, if we add on the last 7 years to that data record, that linear relationship still holds, despite the fact that there can be a lot of internal variability in the climate system. So this is a very robust result. And we see this also in the climate models. Now, arguably, we probably would want to use sea ice volume, because I think that's a more important metric, but we really lack at the moment these long-term, robust observations of how thick the ice is in the Arctic. And this is why satellite missions, such as what NASA has been doing and the European Space Agency, to allow us to also detect how much of that ice is there, not just the area of it. And also Mosaic expeditions are really key in improving our process level understanding, so that we could really see, how is this volume of ice changing over time, and what is that threshold? Now, what's been really nice about this study that we did was that we don't necessarily need a climate model to tell us when the Arctic Ocean may become ice-free. If we look at another 700 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, we'll start seeing ice-free summers emerge, and that happens at a temperature threshold of around 1.7 degrees Celsius at the moment. But it's, of course, not just, You might get some ice-free summers, but if we start going towards this 2-degree temperature rise, which is probably more realistic, it's not just 1 month, it could be 3 months in the summer that we'll see no more sea ice. But this provides us real concrete limits that we have to start considering when we're talking about limiting our carbon emissions. It's not an irreversible process at this point. As Marcus mentioned, we have these negative feedbacks in the climate system that help us grow back ice in the wintertime. Thin ice grows much faster than thick ice, so you can quickly recover it. But that means we have to stop adding more carbon to the atmosphere.
And you mentioned that at 2 degrees, we may end up with the situation, and you can sort of almost see it graphically here with the open water. 3 to 4 months out of the year, perhaps from July to October, once we breach 2 degrees, what would be the global feedbacks from having that dark water for such a long period of time?
Well, I mean, obviously the ecosystems, the people, and the resources in the Arctic already are uniquely adapted to this pre-existing climate, which depended on sea ice covering the Arctic Ocean year-round. And so we're changing that dramatically at the moment. So we're losing that reflective sea ice cover that reflects much of the sun's energy back out to space, and now that's being absorbed into the Arctic Ocean. And when we look at a target of 2 degrees for global warming, in the Arctic, that's 8 degrees in autumn and early winter. So you're looking at really enhanced warming that's going to prolong the melting season. So then we think about Greenland's contribution to sea level rise, being able to dump more fresh water into the system. We see, of course, more permafrost thaw. The warming extends way out of the Arctic Ocean across the land surfaces. Also, we see intensification of the hydrological cycle in the Arctic, so we're going to have a lot more precipitation. And that transition at the moment from a snow to rain-dominated Arctic is probably going to happen a couple decades earlier than we previously thought, if we trust the CMIP6 models. But of course, everything is interconnected. So through our atmospheric circulation patterns, or ocean circulation patterns, what happens in the Arctic is not going to stay there. And as Marcus already mentioned, I mean, the temperature contrast between the equator and the poles drives a lot of our large-scale weather patterns. And there's been several studies that have been showing that, of course, as you, I can advance this, can't I? Oh, maybe. Oh, there we go. So, for example, the loss of the winter sea ice, particularly in the Kara and the Barents Seas, has already been driving pronounced ridging over the Siberian Arctic, over the Urals, which is then, with the wave propagation, can lead to sudden stratospheric warming events, or sometimes also stretching of the polar vortex. So at the moment, there's been this southern lobe that came out over North America, plunging North America into a deep freeze this winter. These sorts of changes seem to be linked in part to the loss of the winter ice cover in the Kara and the Barents Seas, and also increased snowfall over Siberia, which is again a consequence of the fact that we have more open water, we have more precipitation, but that will transition at some point to more rainfall.
So what happens at the poles doesn't stay at the poles. Thank you.
Exactly.
Next, turning more to our oceans and going bipolar a bit more again, Professor Michael Meredith is an oceanographer and science leader at the British Antarctic Survey. He is head of the Polar Oceans team at BAS, which focuses on determining the role of the polar oceans on global climate, ice sheets, and the interdisciplinary ocean system. He is an honorary professor at the University of Bristol and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, among many honors. So, Mike, you were among the IPCC SROC lead authors. What came out with IPCC SROC on our polar oceans in terms of the most important findings, and also perhaps from the AR6 Working Group 1 report that came out last summer? And do you expect any important updates on global impacts from Working Group 2 later this week?
Thank you for the question. The Ocean and Cryosphere report was published a couple of years ago, and I think we do have to thank Monaco in particular. They played a real driving role in commissioning that report, and they also hosted the approval session when the United Nations governments gathered here to approve the report. So I think just a word of thanks to them for getting that report through, getting it commissioned, getting it approved. The report was one of the IPCC special reports. So what it attempted to do was to build a kind of holistic, interdisciplinary overview of the ocean and the cryosphere. So not just how is climate change progressing, why is it going the way it is, what are the impacts, what does it mean for people, the sorts of things that would traditionally appear in separate IPCC reports over a cycle of typically 5 years or more. What it tried to do was to draw those together And so by doing so is trying to package for policymakers the importance of the ocean and the cryosphere. I think the key messages that came out of it, for me, there's an awful lot of scientific detail, but there's kind of three overarching messages, one of which is that the polar regions and the ocean affect everybody and every place in the world. There's nowhere that is immune to the influence of these parts of the Earth system. I think the second one is that they're changing, and they're changing rapidly, and we're still behind the curve in understanding what those changes mean. And the third one is that in future, the polar regions and the ocean are going to look very different to how they look today. We're already committed to changes, some of which are irreversible on human timescales. You know, in 50 years' time, the Arctic will look very different, but there's a choice. We still have it in our power to decide by our actions how different the Arctic, the Antarctic, the oceans are compared to what we have today. And that's how it feeds into the policy space. What we were trying to do was to convey to the policymakers the element of choice that we as a species have, and that they as policymakers have a particular responsibility for.
And I would say most policymakers would agree that it was a sterling example of just doing that. So congratulations on that. If we could bring back up the Q&A slide deck, you've said that the global regions exert a pervasive and intense influence over the whole planet. A large part of the influence is transmitted via the ocean. In what ways?
Okay, so there is a slide. I was kind of anticipating a question along these lines. So if you can bring up the slide.
If you could bring up the slides again, please.
The next one. Is it that one? Okay, fantastic. So this is my favorite projection. If fish could draw and you asked them to draw a world map, something like this is what they would produce. It's not the continents surrounded by water, which is what people would draw. It's the ocean surrounded by land, which is what the fish, everything that lives in the ocean, experience. The reason I love this projection is that it really does emphasize to me that there is just one ocean, and it's fully connected. It's the unifying feature across a huge part of the Earth that we live on. The ocean actually, the polar oceans within that have unique roles. So although there's only one ocean, all of the ocean isn't the same. And the polar regions have very specific importance within that. That becomes a bit clearer if you actually just draw a cartoon on top of it of the global ocean circulation. It's very schematic, but you can see the movement of the water in different layers around the planet. I think the key points to draw out here is around Antarctica. This is where there's kind of a roundabout where the different basins are joined together, and the Southern Ocean around Antarctica can connect those. It can move heat around, it can move carbon around, it can actually influence the entire rest of the planet by what is happening locally within the Southern Ocean. The Arctic may look small here, but there's key transformations happening there between the upper layer circulation and the deeper layer circulation. And those transformations are responsible for forming what's called the headwaters of the Atlantic circulation, which is one of the key things that influences European climate, North American climate, and so on. And so I think it is these sorts of processes, in particular where water masses are transformed and where water rises in the vertical or sinks in the vertical, that exert this global influence. One of the key reasons that this matters so much is because of the amount of heat and the amount of carbon that the ocean can store. Obviously, these are key climatic variables, the amount of heat that's drawn down, the amount of carbon that's drawn down, fundamentally important to our future climate evolution. And the processes, especially in the Southern Ocean, are absolutely critical. We've heard already about the warming of the Southern Ocean, and that's all the heat that's been drawn down from the atmosphere. It also draws down terrific amounts of carbon. So it's doing us a huge climatic favor by moderating the amount of climate change in the atmosphere. That favor comes at a cost. The cost is the warming of the ocean, which impacts the ecosystem. It also impacts the ice sheet, which is what Eric was talking about earlier. It's the heat that's responsible for deflating the Antarctic ice sheet. And the carbon drawdown adds to ocean acidification. And again, that can have damaging effects on ecosystems. So we're reliant on this favor. We don't know how it will evolve in future. It may change in future. It may get less. And if it does, there'll be strong impacts across the whole globe.
And is it indeed the case that the Southern Ocean alone has absorbed maybe 40% of the ocean's carbon? I've seen that figure. So you put the Arctic Ocean and the Southern Ocean together, and they've maybe absorbed 50 to 60% of all the carbon absorbed by water.
Very much so. The Southern Ocean is doing most of the hard work there, but the Arctic is actually very important as well. The Arctic, in a similar way to the Southern Ocean, is very susceptible to acidification through a combination of processes. But what we're doing as humans, by putting loads of carbon in the atmosphere and it sinks into the ocean in these key places, it is damaging, and it will continue to damage the ecosystem in these very sensitive places.
So speaking of atmospheric carbon then, to our final panelist, another very global impact, Dr. Gustav Pugelius is co-director of the Berlin Center for Climate Research at Stockholm University in Sweden. His research interests include the role of soils in the global carbon cycle, basically the potential emissions from the carbon stored in permafrost and peatlands, mostly in the Arctic. He has organized more than 10 expeditions to different Arctic regions, was the founding leader of the Permafrost Carbon Group in the International Permafrost Association, is a steering group member of the Permafrost Carbon Network, and co-chair of the International Soil Carbon Network. So, Gustav, your work, of course, focuses on these permafrost emissions. How can these feed back then into the global climate system?
Thank you, Pam. So is this on?
Please keep the slides up.
Yeah, so perhaps we could have the slides. Thank you. So now, since we're moving from onto the terrestrial land surface, I thought I would give just a quick overview of what permafrost is. So you all know that it's permanently frozen ground. And the key aspect to this permanently frozen ground is that it's ancient. It's been around for usually tens of thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. And during these very long time periods of frozen state, it's accumulated a lot of carbon, huge amounts of old plant remains that have not decomposed because they've been frozen. So the permafrost region is vast. It covers about 15 million square kilometers. That's four times the size of the whole European Union. It's a really, really large area. And it also holds enormous amounts of carbon, roughly 1,500 petagrams, or 1,500 billion tons of carbon. That's roughly twice of all of the carbon that's in the atmosphere today, or 3 times as much as all of the Earth's vegetation. Now, as we start thawing this, the carbon becomes available for decomposition. The microbes start eating the old plant remains, and they produce methane or CO2, depending on the conditions where they are living. And this gives us the permafrost carbon feedback. So essentially, this is a sleeping giant of the global carbon cycle. This image that you see up on the screen is a nice illustration of a very dramatic permafrost thaw landform. You might see a small person in blue there for scale. That's Professor Hyggeland from the Alfred Wegener Institute, some of you may know. And I like this image also because it's the scale of this huge thaw wall behind the person gives us the magnitude of the problem that really is a sleeping giant. And we're seeing emissions starting now, but it's a slow system to respond. But once it really gets momentum, it's inevitable. So the emissions that are coming now are just the start of a system that we've triggered that will keep emitting for centuries potentially.
And if you could also then address what kind of committed emissions we might be looking at different temperature levels in terms of this feedback, because we've started talking about a country of permafrost as kind of an emissions source. Could you give us a sense of what that's going to look like?
Yeah, thank you. So today, best emissions are that permafrost thaw alone is emitting roughly as much as Japan is doing now. But as I said, this is just the initial thaw stages because permafrost responds so slowly to the climate perturbations. This slide that you see here sort of summarizes the cumulative projected emissions from the permafrost to 2100 under different global warming scenarios. The black dots show you what was recently projected by the IPCC AR6, and the purple dots would show you additional projected thaw if you include processes that are not yet included to any of the global climate models. Abrupt thaw processes that happen locally that can really speed up emissions, especially of methane. So we're talking for the 1.5 degree scenario, we're looking at something around the order of 200 gigatons of CO2 equivalents by 2100. And the further downside of that is even if you cap warming at 1.5, once the permafrost is thawed, it will keep emitting for a long time. So this will go up substantially and approach 300-400 if you go several centuries longer. Now, for the higher emission scenarios, you see we are approaching 500-600 gigatons, even up to plus 4 degrees. So it's a very substantial additional emission on top of the individual country emissions that we have to deal with today.
Yeah, so what you're saying then is that the later generations are going to need negative emissions. Let's say we humans get our act together and we come down to net zero even by 2050, which is the IPCC SR 1.5 goal, that we will still have to have negative emissions to offset those coming from permafrost for a couple of hundred years.
Yeah, exactly. So once we've triggered, once these thaw events are triggered, and you get a fundamental change of the permafrost ecosystem, it will keep emitting, often for centuries, even under stabilized conditions. And we see that for every degree of warming, there's roughly 4 million square kilometers of permafrost that is thawed. So we're already at 1.2. So we've already, committed to losing close to 5 million square kilometers of permafrost that will keep emitting for a long time. And that is something that we've already handed to future generations to deal with. And I think relevant to this question is also how you approach the global warming targets. If we think of overshoot scenarios where we go over the target temperature and then want to draw the temperature back down again, buy ourselves some more time before we do the drastic reductions, that actually triggers a lot of extra permafrost thaw that will be non-reversible once you pull the temperature back down. So under overshoot scenarios, here you see examples of how these emissions go up even further. If you overshoot by 0.5 degree or a very strong overshoot of 1 degree, you're up to 400 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in the 1.5 global warming scenario. So that eats up a very substantial part of the remaining carbon budgets to reach that goal, or it implies very long-term negative emissions to actually balance it.
Well, speaking of intergenerational justice, then I would like to bring up the two early career scientists who also will be speaking to us during this session. First, we have Casimir de Levernier, who is from CNRS and the Université de Sorbonne, and Susanna Hancock from APEX. So, Casimir, if you want to go ahead and speak first.
Hi, everyone. So I study Antarctic sea ice, Antarctic bottom water, and the global thermohaline circulation of the ocean that Mike just described. What led me to study the Southern Polar Ocean? I guess the more generic question that we've all asked ourselves is, why do I work on this specific problem? To be honest, my first answer is chance. I accidentally met an oceanographer as I was looking for a master's thesis project. We started to work on ocean mixing using climate models. We noticed that some of these models, they simulate areas of open water within the Antarctic ice pack that tend to decline or disappear under climate warming. We wrote a paper that raised the possibility that climate change has already dampened this important phenomenon. 10 years later, I'm here. But chance can't be the whole story. As a colleague told me once, there is often a driving force, a specific curiosity that shapes our careers. We end up doing what we do, researching what we research, not just by chance, but also because our curiosity is not uniform. It is oriented. In my case, I think two things steered me to Antarctica and the Abyssal Ocean. A curiosity for remote, comparatively unexplored parts of the planet, and an interest in long timescales. Studying something that changes on millennial timescales gives you perspective. It forces you to step back and look at the Earth as a whole. The vertiginous philosophical feeling of looking back to the Ice Age or forward to the 4th millennium is really what drew me to this area of research. Now, there is a downside to this long view. It partly disconnects my research from the 21st century challenges that humanity faces. When I talk to my friends, I can explain what I do, but I cannot say that my research really helps to solve the climate problem. And this rift between the slow, restricted knowledge production of our research and the urgent mitigation actions needed bothers me. And I know it bothers many colleagues, many of us. Now, I found two solutions to reconcile my work with action. The first one is communication about science and climate change to all kinds of audiences. The second one is adapting my research practices to a low-carbon world. So at the L'Océan Laboratory in Paris, where I work, we now monitor and reduce the carbon footprint of our activities. For example, we have emission quotas for transportation to conferences. Now, this transition in our research practices can seem superficial, but I think its entrainment potential is huge. And I also think it's important to maintain our credibility in the long term and to fight this eco-anxiety that is quite pervasive among young climate scientists in particular. So if this research transition is careful, collectively planned, considerate of the value of field campaigns, of knowledge production in general, I think it can greatly benefit both science and society. Thank you for your attention.
I think that was anything but superficial in terms of your story and the steps you've taken. Susanna, what is your story? What brought you to this kind of science?
All right. So in many ways, I was probably your typical American 4-year-old girl. I had a favorite stuffed animal, a raccoon named Abby. I liked to steal sips of my mother's coffee when she wasn't looking. I also didn't like to eat my vegetables. But something that made me a little bit more unique, perhaps, was that I was a budding astrophysicist, and I proudly told everybody who would listen. My grandmother, however, was a product of the Soviet Union, of the Cold War, and the space race. And she was concerned that if I kept on this path, she trusted my waist-length blonde ringlets, apparently. If I kept on this path, that she might lose her eldest grandchild to some Soviet resurgence. I didn't know about the Cold War. I didn't know about US-Soviet relations, but I liked the sound of the space race. So I decided I better learn Russian, just in case. By age 14, I had started at university studying astrophysics. And I kept hearing about how amazing it was that I had such a prodigious start, that I knew what I wanted to be from such a young age and never wavered. That I'd received my first academic grant while still in grade school. Secretly, however, I was miserable. I felt like I was on a trajectory over which I, Susanna, had no control. I felt voicing my opinions would be akin to letting everybody down. For me, it felt so weird, so wrong to be studying with people who were looking for other habitable Earths elsewhere in the universe, while we were actively destroying the one Earth we have, since we have no planet B. At the time, my class notes were riddled with diagrams, drawings, designs, translating concepts I was learning in astrophysics to our planet here on Earth. The one that particularly stuck out to me at the time was that of the albedo. As our glaciers, polar regions melt, less ice is reflected off the Earth's surface. I thought to myself, if only I could come up with a way to increase the Earth's albedo, we could slow the rate of warming. Problem solved, I thought. All I had to do was save the polar ice caps. No biggie. I grew up at this time testifying for US climate legislation. I wrote letters in Russian to the Duma, getting them on board. With my astrophysics interest, I relied on science. Science, I felt, was my secret weapon. It made me feel invincible. Science doesn't care whether one believes in it or not. Just keep sciencing. Consequently, I felt that somehow, maybe I wanted to believe, that science was maybe apolitical. I was 14. Today, I still struggle with science and politics. Perhaps some of it is my Americanness, where at times it feels that acknowledging what's going on with our planet is rooted in party lines, and wanting to do something about it is a far extreme position. When our former Department of Energy leader says the environment, what's going on with our environment is not about the climate, but is a battle between the reds and the blues, how can science thrive? How can it affect policy in the ways we need? But ultimately, I think what drives me forward today as a multidisciplinary Arctic scientist, geopolicist, is not just the desire to understand what's going on with our planet, the desire to understand the global consequences, geopolitical in nature, of our warming poles. Not just to affect policy, but to find that human connection that can transcend science, can transcend policy, politics, that turns all of us into that 14-year-old girl, terrified by what she sees going on with her planet, but the fear of that is only matched by the scale of her dreams.
Thank you both so much. Your reward for standing up in front of this wonderful group of senior scientists is that you get to put them on the spot with questions. So please go ahead.
One question to start. In Antarctica, there are some counterintuitive trends over the past decades, with a slight but significant expansion of the Antarctic sea ice and some significant cooling at the surface. Do you think we understand these trends well enough, and how should we explain them to the general public? Because they stand out when you show a map of surface temperature changes, for example.
Eric, I'm pretty sure that's you.
I thought it was Julian.
Well, I can talk to the sea ice part of it. Yeah, and I think we already saw today that Antarctic sea ice is currently tracking at the lowest that we've seen. At NSIDC, we've chosen not to make that a big point yet, because in part there's a huge amount of internal variability in the Antarctic sea ice cover. And this has been, of course, a challenge, I think, in climate modeling in particular, in that all the climate models do show that the Antarctic sea ice should be shrinking as the climate warms, and it hasn't been doing that yet. Maybe it's starting to show signs of it today, but it's been challenging because we just don't have, I think, long enough data records to really look at that internal variability and to really separate that from the anthropogenic signal. But I think Mike can probably talk about the surface waters more.
Thank you for that. I think you asked, do we understand these changes well enough? The answer is certainly no, we don't. I think in terms of, and that's what makes them an interesting scientific target. That's why they should be focuses of future research. In terms of explaining them to the public or to non-scientists, I think the key thing to mention is that the Southern Ocean is a big place. There's regional variability, there's vertical variability in what's going on. But if you take an average, an integral around the whole Southern Ocean of heat, what you find is it's going up, and it's going up very, very strongly. And that's really the overarching message from many of the climate points of view. That doesn't mean the cooling's not important, it clearly is. But if you're talking to the general public and wanted to give them one headline message, I think it's the rapid accumulation of heat in the Southern Ocean is what I would suggest talking to them about.
I can also add to it, perhaps. Do we understand it sufficiently? Certainly not. I think that's a standard response in science, but we do have a basic understanding of it, and we need to do much more research to consolidate that. greenhouse gas molecules warm the planet because they absorb upwelling long-wave thermal radiation, and there is very little in the interior of the Antarctic continent because the surface is so high and cold, and therefore just the intensity of the upwelling thermal radiation is much lower than in the Arctic, and therefore the handle for the greenhouse gas molecules is smaller, and therefore the temperature contrast purely based on radiative arguments in the Antarctic has a tendency to go up if everything else would stay the same. If the temperature gradient goes up, then the circular wind blowing around the Antarctic also goes up. It suppresses the meridional transport of air, suppressing the flux of latent and sensible heat from lower latitudes to higher latitudes, which is amplifying that effect. And then the ozone hole above, which has developed over the past decades, also has the same effect of strengthening the wind going around the Antarctic and suppressing the meridional transport of heat. The ozone hole signal will now reverse. The greenhouse gas forcing will keep going up, at least to some degree. So it's very interesting to see what's going to happen, and all these arguments only apply to the interior of the Antarctic continent. The coastal areas, the Southern Ocean areas are completely different, and the processes there are different, and particularly at the peninsula, the processes are different. But for the interior of the Antarctic continent, no, we need to point out clearly to the public, we are not confused by the fact that we don't find a strong warming there. We have a basic understanding of it. We need to understand it better, but it's not an argument which would undermine our general understanding that greenhouse gases are warming the planet.
The way we've often put it to policymakers is also that there's a big difference between an ocean surrounded by land and a continent surrounded by ocean. So, Susanna.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on something mentioned a moment ago from you, is how does the increased interest of the public influence positively or negatively sort of this research or science moving forward?
Sorry.
Looks like Mike is volunteering, Dan. That's a difficult question.
How do we increase the interest of the public?
So just more people being involved or interested in what's going on with the polar regions, what's going on with the climate.
So I think there's a combination of ways that can be done. One is to keep stressing the importance of the polar regions to the whole planet, including where those people are, where they live. It'll impact them, it'll impact their lives, their livelihoods, their cultures, it'll impact everything. And so having an intimate knowledge of what's going on in the polar regions is absolutely critical for them. I think at the same time, there's a huge amount of gain to be had with some of the outreach activities. And we've seen some of the videos here today, which are absolutely stunning. And they do convey this real sense of excitement and adventure and exploration. The polar regions are still, arguably the least explored places on the planet. And anyone with a bit of an adventurous mind will think, wow, let's go and look there. What might we find if we went there? And Marcus's expedition, there was a fantastic documentary about the Mosaic Expedition that was shown on national television in the UK and had people gripped. Everyone was talking about it the following day. So I think the more we can remind people about the importance of these areas, but at the same time couple that to these really exciting outreach activities that spur excitement, that's a really strong way, I think, of capturing people's imagination and hanging on to it.
But on the flip side of that, does it affect how you do the science? Does it affect how you perform the science, knowing there's that public audience?
I don't think my own personal view, I don't think it need affect how you do the science. I think the science is part of the story. The science is part of the finding out and is part of the excitement, as well as just going to new places and looking in regions that no one's ever looked before, or depths where no one's ever looked before. I think finding out exciting new things about how they work, whether it's the physics of the ocean or the animals that live in the ocean or the ice, whatever it might be. That excitement, if you can couple that, the importance of what you're looking at, the excitement of finding out new and important things about it, then you have a really nice synergy between, pushing some really strong science, some really important science goals, and still capturing the public's imagination with the excitement of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it looks like we have some other commentators. I mean, I think it's important to draw a connection to people's actual lives, and I'm wondering if anyone has a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Mike in a lot of ways, but except for the fact in the Arctic, as we know, you have many people that live up in the Arctic that are being right now affected by climate change in that region, and I think that's really changing now. Not my pure research interest, but certainly now it's implications of this and working together with local communities and how it's impacting them. And I think a lot of our science now is moving more in towards trying to help communities adapt and become resilient to climate change, because this is something that they're having to deal with. And a lot of the causes are happening in lower latitudes, but it's affecting the northern communities.
I think it affects the way we are doing science in one other way. It's a great interest that we have found from the public in our work. I think we now fully understand that, and we start to build in the communication modules into our projects right from the beginning as an internal part of what we are doing, not as some add-on which we think about after the expedition. We build it into our plans, and I think that is extremely important because we do have the potential to advance science with our expeditions, but we also have the potential to educate our societies about what's happening and what are the consequences of our current day decisions. And that is a basic for the transformation we need, because we are living in democracies. The majority of the people in our countries decide what we do. So we need to educate. It's so important that we do that. And I'm glad that there is a high interest. And I think for us as scientists, we have a responsibility to use it and to use it to inform and to educate the people.
Thank you both so much. I wanted to flip a bit just to see if there were any questions online that you would like to pose. And otherwise, we can go to the floor.
Julianne, can I have my mic? So far, the one question we had was very similar to the one that Susanna just asked about the influence that all this public interest has on your role as scientists and researchers. I think we spoke to that. I just want to say to everyone who is watching at home, don't forget, you can send in your questions on Slidos. Please feel free to do that. And also here in the house, does anyone have a question for our panel? Someone? Oh, here you go. Sure.
Yeah, actually more a sort of statement from the floor. This is going back to the question of why Antarctic sea ice was advancing slowly. And there is an explanation, something like Marcus's one, which is thinking about books for the public. This is in a book called A Farewell to Ice, which I wrote. And it's saying, well, look, let's just look at the dynamics of Antarctic sea ice. And what's happened in the last few years has been that the average wind speed of the westerlies has increased quite radically. And if you're increasing the eastward speed of drift of Antarctic sea ice, you're going to increase its northward component because of Coriolis force. So your sea ice rotating around Antarctica is a bit like somebody on a roundabout being thrown off. So the ice is being moved northwards by the additional Coriolis force, and that means that it gets further north before it melts. So it doesn't mean there's more ice, but it does mean that the ice that's there is distributed over a wider range of latitude, so the northern ice limit is further north. That will only happen until you start to run out of ice, which is what's happened recently, that the mechanism that can produce a wider range of ice actually stops working when the ice doesn't grow so much anymore, which is what's started to happen now.
Might we ask who was the author of the book, A Farewell to Ice?
Sorry, that's me. Yeah.
Oh, that was you. Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Available from Penguin Books.
Are there any more questions from the floor? We can run the microphone. Yeah, back there. And while the microphone is being run, if you could raise your hand again.
Who has the question? There we go.
Yeah,
Thank
exactly.
you.
Do any of you have questions for each other? Okay, the mic is reaching you in time. Go ahead.
Can you stand, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goshi Śmieszek, UIT, the Arctic University of Norway. Thank you very much to all the presenters. I hope you can hear me with the mask. I guess one commentary, but perhaps also a question to the panel, is that, of course, when we are discussing all the changes, I mean, what I find a bit striking is that we keep on referring all the time to the CO2 and equivalence of CO2. And of course, it is extremely important. It is by far the best measure we have. But I think what strikes me is that whenever we are recommending action, we are exclusively focusing here in this discussion on CO2, and we are not really talking about short-lived climate forcers. And that's been a part of the conversation that I've been missing because, sorry, this mask, I admire how you all do this. Oh.
You can take it down to speak for the question.
Way better this way. And so part of my question is perhaps how we as scientists can bring more attention to short-lived climate forcers. I mean, of course, in the Arctic, we can talk about the black carbon. My particular interest is about methane. And of course, I'm saying this also for a reason because we know that the action, even the fastest one that we have now concentrated on CO2, is not going to bring results fast enough. It's just like what is baked into the system, it's already there. And especially when we are focusing only on CO2, of course, when we start actually reducing, well, hopefully moving in the right direction, we are going to take down sulfates from the atmosphere. And of course, the panel can surely say more about this. But the point is that we will start unmasking warming that is already in the system. So in a sense, for instance, the quick action on methane, and I'm thinking here in particular on the methane from human activities, seems to be one of our best chances to actually, well, to enforce the climate action. So that was a commentary, but I also wanted to ask a panel on the views on the action on short-lived climate forcers, and perhaps how you also see possibility for scientists to engage with that. Thank you.
I'm afraid I might be the most qualified to answer that question because ICCI was involved in the founding of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. My answer might be a little bit different from what you might expect, though, and then I'll ask any of the scientists to answer what they please. Yes, they're important. Their action is short-lived, right? That's part of their commentary. And we do projects as an organization on black carbon near cryosphere regions because it can have an influence. However, because they're short-lived, bringing them down is going to have a very immediate impact whenever you do it. And the problem is that as CO2 continues to rise, the role of short-lived forcers has always been to bend the curve in conjunction with CO2 reductions. The CO2 is going to stay in the atmosphere a lot longer than the methane and a whole lot longer than black carbon, which only lasts for a few weeks. And so, yes, they're important. Yes, they have a lot of co-benefits. But if we don't get a handle on CO2, if you look at some of the modeling that's been done, all of the benefits that come from addressing, say, short-lived climate forcers between now and 2030, if we take them out to zero, it'll be erased in just 5 or 7 years by continued rises in CO2. So we need to walk and chew gum at the same time, certainly. We need to do both. But we really do need to address the CO2 problem because it's continuing to rise and we're not seeing the about 7% decrease we should be seeing every year moving forward. Does anyone else want to comment on the role of SLFs, SLCPs, whatever you want to call them?
Thank you. Yeah, I will actually comment a little bit on the other side of it. I think, I mean, obviously, there is a role for methane and reductions as well, but CO2 is still, primary long-term target. But I also wanted to comment on. I mentioned numbers of release from permafrost thaw of around 200 gigatons of CO2 equivalents, and actually roughly a third of that radiative forcing in the next century will actually be from methane, which I just showed, the compound numbers. And we do also see that, of course, the methane forcing goes down a lot more quickly than the CO2 forcing. So the methane forcing would peak in roughly 80 to 120 years, depending on scenarios. And then the landforms that produce all this methane will actually stabilize, and the CO2 will still remain the long-term player for the permafrost carbon feedback. You often hear about a methane bomb, and there is certainly, concern you should be concerned about the release of methane from permafrost, but on the long term, the CO2 will sort of outlive it and outbalance it.
Obviously, the short-lived climate forces reducing their emissions can buy us time, and time is a variable currency right now, because we have started so late in reducing our long-lived greenhouse gas emissions. So buying time is something very useful to do right now. It won't solve the problem, but I can just underline that comment. We can avoid crossing tipping points between now and the end of the century if we also reduce our emissions of short-lived climate forces. And avoiding crossing tipping points obviously is something important to do.
If we walk and chew gum at the same time, again. We have time, I think, for one more question.
Thank you. I'm here representing Polar Educators International, and I would like to link with what Susanna asked before, which was how can we get the interest of the public? And in a way, educators are what is needed to link the public and the scientists. Polar Educators International was founded in 2012 as a result of the International Polar Year. And we are still working very much in filtering the information from science in an understandable way for education at any level, which is not just teaching in schools, but just information, museum curators, anybody. And we are also aiming at a second edition of the book that was published by the International Polar Year. And I would be glad to explain and to talk about it. So really, scientists can be helped to get more understood by the public as communicators, and certainly educators need the science very much. And not just polar, because as we've seen this morning, polar also means global climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Does anyone want to comment?
I would like to just make a quick comment about education on this because, and this is going to come from a US perspective, but I have a colleague that's done a lot of polling of people in the US about their understanding of the Arctic regions or the Antarctic, and also about, what do they think that what's happening in the polar regions is affecting them? And what's really interesting to me is that a lot of the people that have been polled, they don't even know, for example, that there's actually ocean at the North Pole, but yet they really believe that whatever's happening in the Arctic is influencing their weather, which I find quite interesting because, geographically and some of just the science facts even about the sea ice melting, they don't necessarily believe that, but they are believing the headlines in the newspapers now that what's going on in the Arctic, if you have this cold air outbreaks over North America, this is linked to the Arctic. So we need to focus on education dramatically in our school systems, especially in the US, because I think there's a real lack of understanding about the physical processes, which then makes it very hard, I think, with media as well and the communications to the general public.
Thanks again. I don't think that's a US-specific problem. We, in the beginning of the Mosaic Expedition, when we still had 2 vessels on the way, when we sailed together with the academic Fedorov, we had more space on board, and we had a group of teachers from the US and from Germany on board, which developed material for school classes, which is now widely used in several different areas. And I think having that in mind, thinking about it when designing an experiment or when designing a project and making it part of it is very useful because it can help with exactly the point you just made.
Thank you. Last chance for comments. Otherwise, I really want to thank Eric for his wonderful keynote and the panelists. And I'm going to say a few closing words, sort of following Antje in terms of looking ahead. If you could bring up the closing slides, I'd appreciate it. But this has been a really interesting exchange of views, looking ahead to what we need to do then to make more clear to the rest of the world that what is happening in these polar regions is also going to have an influence on them. And as we look ahead over the next year to COP27, we had a Cryosphere Pavilion at COP25, which many of you contributed to. That was asked actually by Chile as an Antarctic nation. Glasgow, Scotland considered itself an Arctic or near Arctic nation. Why Egypt? And this is the reason, because Egypt, and this is an important point to make, Egypt is connected to the poles, because this is 1 meter of sea level rise on the Nile Delta. It's one of the most susceptible regions to sea level rise. And if I can click through quickly, if it allows me to, doesn't seem to be moving forward. Down this way? Yeah.
Julianne, can you
just go ahead? There we go. There's 3 meters, there's 6 meters, and 10 meters, which, as Rob DeCanto said, is not actually overruled around 2300. You're almost to Cairo by then. And I'd also note that the Blue Nile arises in some of Africa's last remaining glaciers. And I wanted to end a bit with a moment of hope as well, because if you can click forward again, when we look at emissions reductions, the special report on 1.5 degrees showed us a pathway forward. And they showed that what we need to do is 50% reductions, very steep in the next decade by 2030, coming to carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. And as the common and short-lived forcers, other greenhouse gases need to come down as well. Click forward again, please. We're still a long way off of that, but it is still possible. And if you can just click forward now about 4 or 5 times, the special report on 1.5 degrees made it clear that it is, if you could click ahead, physically possible, economically possible. So please keep clicking. You'll see some green checks come down, which the emissions pathway scientists looked at. Please keep clicking. Once, going one, oh, no, go backwards. There we go. You're going backwards. Go forwards, please.
Julienne, dans l'autre sens. Faut avancer dans l'autre sens. Voilà. Continue.
Continuez. Yep.
Continue.
One.
Okay.
Again. It's up to us, in other words. It really is within our power. And as long as the scientists keep on saying to us that we can still stay close to 1.5 degrees, I think it's important for us as both policymakers and scientists to make it clear that it is still within our reach. And it really is, as many of the scientists on the panel, and as Eric said, it is a decision that we have to make, and it is not outside of our power. It is not happening to us. We are doing it to ourselves. And that is a very important message from the polar regions to the rest of the world. And with that, thank you very much. We have a very special guest, so we're ending a bit early. And please stay seated so that we can hear the next speech. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Pam Pearson. Thank you so much to our panel for this second session. Thank you again so much to all of you. As Pam just said, we'll now have some short closing remarks from the French ambassador for polar and maritime issues. Would you please welcome Olivier Poivre d'Avor.
So the day was probably long for some of you. It was always difficult to be at the end, but it's really a pleasure for me to be here in Monaco. So all of you, ladies and gentlemen and friends, first of all, thank you so much, Pam. Where is Pam? She's here. And all of you around these tables, impressive messengers you are for what you have been provided since this morning in analysis, data, informations, contributions about polar changes, change in the poles, and dramatic amplification on global climate changes. Yes, Yes, the cold is really getting hot. So hot that I have to rewrite my brief, I promise you, my brief speech. Today is not a day like another one. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced at dawn a military operation in Ukraine, where powerful explosions sounded since this morning in several cities. Kiev claims that a full-scale invasion is underway, and my president, most of them, all of them, around the world, Mr. Macron declared that France strongly condemns Russia's decisions to wage war on Ukraine, and that Russia must immediately put an end to its military operations. The international community, not only politicians, but also all of us, citizens, chattering class, scientists probably, at large, stand in solidarity by the Ukrainians and act to stop the war. I know I've not been invited here to speak about politics and war. I've come here to speak about ocean and the polar world, which I believe can give peace a chance, like in the song of John Lennon and in the words today of Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the UN. Just a quick reminder, but you know that perfectly. In 1957, the International Geophysical Year was a global marker of awareness of the polar worlds. From then on, major nations invested across science to understand the polar messages. This awareness allowed that in the very midst of the Cold War, nations agreed to sign the International Polar Treaty, the Antarctic Treaty, although the world in the very midst of the Cold War was divided between West and the East, led by the Soviet Union. This treaty offered a unique mode of governance, and you all know the value of it. 30 years later, in 1991, Michel Rocard from France and Bob Hawke from Australia, hailed as heroes of the Antarctic, launched together the Madrid process, of which we celebrated the 20th years. During these two exceptional days, Prince Albert, one of the most committed head of state in the world for ocean and poles, has committed himself with this polar initiative, reminding us that the poles have strong messages, but not voices. These voices are the states who got to make them heard. In my mandate as ambassador for the poles, I can only congratulate this polar initiative launched by His Sovereign Highness Prince Albert II of Monaco. Sorry, I changed my speech a few minutes ago. And this topic, polar issue, is the issue which are now discussing in my country. So we are going to present in a few days the first national polar strategy entitled Balancing the Extremes, Équilibrer les Extrêmes. As change as the poles affecting the global climate and life on Earth are accelerating, and because we are all affected, we need also to accelerate our decisions and actions to try to reverse the situation. Issues such as the melting of the Arctic ice pack in summer, the melting of the ice caps in Greenland, but also in Antarctica, are at the heart of our discussion, which needs immediately decision actions. Our symposium today and tomorrow should aim to feed into and guide urgently national and international political decisions and commitments. In a few days, we will present our new and first national polar strategy, covering both Arctic and Antarctic.
Yeah.
Considering the global polar issues as the interest of our country and polar research as a major tool for political decision-making, we will finally have a real strategic roadmap for our polar actions. We acknowledge in Brest 2 weeks ago at the One Nation Summit, and the President Macron himself acknowledged that we French had fallen far behind over the last few decades in terms of public investments, whereas other countries, some of which were more recent in this commitment, had decided to do much more. We therefore have a decade of action ahead of us on many subjects, and we will have to commit ourselves collectively as champions of biodiversity protection, especially in Antarctica. This research, scientific, and cooperation projects will be carried out in association with all the French, but mainly the foreign players. We share a common desire to learn more about the poles in order to better protect them and thereby preserve the future of our planet. Far from being the sole concern of their neighbor, the Arctic and the Antarctica are now global issues indeed. They tell us about the deteriorated state of our planet, embodying with shocking image the serious dangers. Everything that is happening in this warming cold world, the exploitation of raw materials, industrial development, maritime traffic, melting ice, rising world ocean levels, loss of biodiversity, overfishing, massive release of CO2 is obviously of prime importance for all countries and citizens of the world. But I don't forget other risks among them. Questioning of governments, economic greed, economic war, simply war. For all these reasons, Arctic will be one of the major challenges of the next few years, both climatic and geopolitical. Some countries have definitely a very strong vision or definition of the geography, especially in introducing themselves as quasi-Arctic countries. The Antarctic, the planet's main thermal regulator, has obvious geopolitical difference. But the situation is no less complex. Antarctica is today at the center of all enviousness. China and Russia are increasingly present in this remote and coveted area. For what? Is that for science, leadership? What kind of leadership? Economy, military, mining, science? The question is open. This move questions us even more. What means are we putting in place to avoid a geopolitical conflict? In both poles, we must, at the same time, fight against global warming and prevent the resurgence of the international tensions. In both poles, the creation of marine protected areas is an essential pillar of biodiversity preservation. France, together with the European Union and a large number of countries, will continue to support the request for the classification of marine protected areas in East Antarctica and the Weddell Sea. This is absolutely essential if we are to protect both the biodiversity protection agenda and the fight against global warming. It will be more and more difficult since this morning to convince Russia. In both poles, thanks to the dedication, the scientific community, we need, as ever, to balance the extremes. So more than ever, we need science, science, and science again. So we need you, and we need science and peace. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à vous, Olivier Poivre d'abord. Well, that wraps up this first day of this first ever Polar Symposium. Thank you again so much to all of you for your attention, whether you were here with us in person in Monaco or watching us from behind a screen, wherever you are around the world. Now I'm just going to address those of you who are lucky enough to be here in Monaco with us today. You can get a chance to further discuss everything we've heard today at a cocktail, which will start at 5:30 p.m. right here in the museum. In the meantime, until the cocktail starts at 5:30, please feel free to visit the museum. You can go in with your badge, it's no problem. Take a stroll outside, go check out the sea turtles in the garden, which are really wonderful. Just take some time to talk to each other. Now, after the cocktail, shuttle buses will go back to the Novotel between 6:30 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. So cocktail at 5:30, shuttle buses 6:30 to 7:30. As for tomorrow morning, we're starting a little bit earlier, 8:30 a.m. start. So the buses will leave as of 8:15 at the very latest. So we count on you to have fun tonight, but not too much fun, so everyone makes the bus tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. And with that, have a wonderful evening. See you tomorrow.